The numbers don't add up, Sandra. They never have. My name's Joe. I'm 31 and I've been working in finance long enough to know when something's wrong with the books. For the past 18 months, I'd been handling compliance reviews for Kelthorne Financial, the investment firm my wife Sandra's father, Harold, built from nothing in Norfolk, Virginia. What started as occasional discrepancies had become a pattern I couldn't ignore anymore. Sandra had always been the golden child. Harold treated her like she walked on water, especially after she joined the firm 3 years ago to manage client accounts. "She's got the touch," he'd say whenever someone praised her performance. Natural-born businesswoman, just like her old man. But I'd been watching the client statements she prepared, cross-referencing them with the actual portfolio balances, and the math wasn't working. Small amounts at first. A few hundred here, 1,000 there. Retirement accounts that showed steady growth on paper, but had actual balances that didn't match. When I'd mention it to Sandra, she'd laugh it off. "You're overthinking it, Joe. Dad's accounting system is old school. Sometimes transfers take time to process." She'd kiss my cheek and change the subject, but her eyes would go cold for just a second. The worst part was watching Harold beam with pride every time Sandra presented her quarterly reports. "Look at these returns," he'd tell the other advisors. "Sandra's clients are outperforming the market by 12%. But I knew those clients weren't seeing those returns. Their actual accounts were bleeding money while Sandra's personal spending had tripled. Last month, I'd started documenting everything. Screenshots of discrepancies, copies of false statements, records of transfers that didn't exist. I told myself I was being paranoid, that there had to be an explanation. But when I saw Mildred Peterson's account statement showing a balance of $87,000 when the actual account held $62,000, I knew I couldn't pretend anymore. Mildred was 74 years old. That money was supposed to cover her medical expenses. The file folder sat in my desk drawer like a loaded gun. Every day I'd come home, kiss Sandra hello, and watch her laugh at something on television while I wondered if she was stealing from families who trusted her father with their life savings. She'd gotten a new car last month, a BMW, she said, was a company bonus. Harold had been so proud. "Working late again?" Sandra asked from the kitchen doorway. She was wearing the diamond bracelet she'd bought herself for their anniversary. $2,400. She'd said, "Another bonus." I closed my laptop and looked at her. My wife, the woman I'd loved for 6 years, married for 3, the woman who might be destroying lives while her father celebrated her success. Something was about to break. I could feel it. I'd met Sandra at a coffee shop near the university where I was finishing my finance degree. She was beautiful, confident, and had this way of making everything seem possible. Her father had just started Kelthorne Financial, and she'd talk about how they were going to help families in Norfolk build real wealth. "Not like those big firms in Richmond," she'd say. "We're going to know our clients' names, their kids' names, their dreams." Harold had been skeptical of me at first. I came from a working-class family in Newport News. My dad fixed boats at the shipyard. My mom cleaned houses, but Sandra convinced him I was good with numbers. And after I graduated, he offered me a position handling compliance and auditing. "Keep us honest," he'd said with a laugh. "Can't afford any mistakes in this business." For the first 2 years, everything felt right. Sandra was passionate about helping clients, often staying late to review portfolios or taking calls on weekends when retirees had questions about their accounts. Harold would beam when he'd see her dedication. "She gets it," he'd tell me. "This business is about trust. People hand you their futures, and you'd better treat that like sacred ground." But something shifted after Sandra's promotion to senior account manager. The late nights continued, but the client calls stopped. She'd come home exhausted, claiming she'd been restructuring portfolios or researching new investment opportunities. When I'd ask about specific clients, she'd get vague. "You know, I can't discuss confidential client information, Joe." The first red flag was small. Margaret Williams, a widow whose husband had been Harold's first client, called the office asking why her monthly statement showed a balance different from what she'd calculated. Sandra handled the call, explaining it was a reporting delay in the system, but I checked Margaret's account myself. The money Sandra claimed was there simply wasn't. I started paying closer attention. Sandra's wardrobe improved dramatically. Designer handbags, expensive jewelry, frequent spa visits. When I'd ask about the spending, she'd remind me about her performance bonuses. Harold had indeed implemented a bonus structure, but the amount Sandra was spending far exceeded what those bonuses should have covered. The breaking point came when I overheard her on the phone with someone named Derek talking about moving the Richmond funds and making sure the trail stays clean. When I asked about Derek later, she claimed he was a compliance consultant Harold had hired, but Harold had never mentioned any consultant. And when I casually brought up Derek's name during lunch with my father-in-law, he looked confused. Derek who? Harold had asked. Sandra hasn't mentioned working with any outside consultants. That night, I started a file folder. Every discrepancy, every suspicious transaction, every lie that didn't add up, I told myself I was protecting the business Harold had built, protecting the families who trusted us with their retirement savings. I just didn't know yet how deep Sandra's betrayal actually went. The moment everything crystallized was December 15th, exactly 9 days before Christmas Eve. I was reviewing year-end reports when I noticed something that made my blood run cold. Thomas and Ruth Bailey, both 81 years old, had trusted Keller Financial with their entire life savings of $137,000. According to Sandra's statements, their account had grown to $153,000. But when I accessed the actual account, the balance showed $89,000, $64,000 missing from an elderly couple's retirement fund. I sat in my office until well past midnight, cross-referencing every account Sandra managed. The pattern was systematic, methodical. She'd been skimming money from retirees and covering it up with falsified statements. The victims were always older clients, people who rarely checked their accounts online and trusted the quarterly paper statements Sandra personally prepared. The total came to $218,000 stolen from 11 different families. I drove home in silence, my hands shaking on the steering wheel. When I walked into our house, Sandra was in the living room wrapping Christmas presents, humming softly to herself. She looked up and smiled, this warm, loving expression that used to make my heart skip. Now it made me sick. "You're home late," she said, tying a ribbon around a box. "I got your sister that scarf she wanted." I watched her finish wrapping the gift. Watched her place it carefully under our tree next to all the other presents she'd bought with stolen money. The BMW in our driveway, the diamond bracelet on her wrist, the vacation to Mexico she'd planned for January. All of it paid for with money that belonged to people like Thomas and Ruth Bailey, who probably couldn't afford to heat their house this winter because of what Sandra had done. "How was work?" she asked, not looking up from her wrapping. "Fine," I said. But it wasn't fine. Nothing was fine. The woman I'd loved, the woman I'd married, the woman Harold trusted with his business and his legacy, was a thief. She was stealing from the most vulnerable people in our community while her father praised her performance and planned to leave her the company. I went upstairs and opened my laptop. For the next 3 hours, I compiled everything into a single devastating file. Screenshots of the real account balances, copies of the false statement Sandra had created, a detailed breakdown showing exactly how much money had been stolen from each family. I saved it all to a flash drive and labeled it simply "The Truth About Sandra." I didn't sleep that night. I lay next to my wife, listening to her breathe, knowing that in 9 days, I'd have to decide whether to destroy her life or let her destroy the lives of 11 innocent families. The decision, it turned out, would be made for me. December 22nd, I decided to give Sandra one last chance. Maybe there was an explanation I'd missed. Maybe the missing money was tied up in some investment strategy I didn't understand. I needed to believe my wife wasn't capable of what the evidence clearly showed. "Sandra," I said over breakfast, "I've been reviewing some of the client accounts and I'm seeing some discrepancies." She paused with her coffee cup halfway to her lips. "What kind of discrepancies?" "Account balances that don't match the statements." "Pretty significant differences." I kept my voice neutral. "Professional. I think we should tell your father so we can figure out what's happening." The change in her expression was instant. The warmth vanished, replaced by something cold and calculating. Joe, you need to be very careful about making accusations. You can't prove. I'm not making accusations. I'm identifying problems that need to be addressed. Are you? She set down her coffee and leaned back in her chair. Because it sounds like you're questioning my work, my father's business, the business that pays for this house, your car, everything we have. I felt like I'd been slapped. Sandra, I'm trying to protect the business if there are problems with client accounts. There are no problems, she said sharply. What there is a husband who's apparently been going through confidential client files without authorization. Do you know what Harold would think about that? The threat was clear. She was going to make me the problem. Make it look like I was the one acting inappropriately. I have authorization to review those files. It's literally my job. Your job is compliance oversight, not investigating senior account managers. She stood up, smoothing her skirt. Maybe you should focus on your own responsibilities instead of trying to undermine mine. That afternoon, Harold called me into his office. Sandra was already there sitting in the chair across from his desk with her hands folded and her eyes red like she'd been crying. Joe, Harold said, his voice heavy with disappointment. Sandra tells me you've been making some concerning allegations about her client management. I looked at Sandra, who was staring at her hands. She'd gotten to him first, spun the story her way. Harold, I've identified some serious discrepancies in client account balances that need immediate attention. What kind of discrepancies? Statements that don't match actual account values. In some cases, significant amounts of money that appear to be missing. Harold's face darkened. That's a very serious accusation, Joe. Are you absolutely certain about what you're saying? I have documentation. Documentation you obtained by accessing confidential client files without proper authorization. Sandra interrupted. Joe's been conducting some kind of unauthorized investigation into my work. Is that true? Harold asked. I felt the trap closing around me. I was reviewing accounts as part of my compliance responsibilities. Sandra's account specifically, Harold said. Why would you target your wife's work? The question hung in the air. How could I explain that I'd started investigating because I'd noticed my wife's spending patterns didn't match her stated income? How could I tell Harold his daughter was a thief without sounding like a jealous husband trying to sabotage his wife's career? I review all account managers' work, I said weakly. Harold sighed and rubbed his forehead. Joe, I'm going to need you to take some time off through the holidays. We'll discuss this situation after New Year's when everyone's had a chance to cool down. Harold, please just look at the documentation I've compiled. I don't want to see any documentation you've obtained through unauthorized access, he said firmly. Sandra, I want you to conduct a full review of your client accounts. Make sure everything is properly documented and up to standard. Sandra nodded solemnly. Of course, Dad. I'll have everything organized by the time Joe returns from his break. I walked out of that office knowing Sandra had won the first round. She'd positioned herself as the victim of an overzealous husband, and Harold had bought it completely. Worse, she now had advanced warning in time to cover her tracks. That night, Sandra was surprisingly affectionate. She made my favorite dinner, opened a bottle of wine, and talked about how we could use my vacation time to reconnect as a couple. Maybe this is a blessing in disguise, she said, curling up next to me on the couch. We can spend Christmas Eve with my family and really enjoy the holidays. I nodded and smiled, but inside I was calculating. Sandra thought she'd neutralized the threat. Harold thought he'd solved a personnel problem. Neither of them knew I still had the flash drive hidden in my desk at home with copies of everything I'd discovered. They thought they'd won. They had no idea the game was just beginning. Christmas Eve morning, while Sandra was at the salon getting ready for her family celebration, I received a call that changed everything. It was Derek Morrison, the man I'd heard Sandra talking to on the phone weeks earlier. Except Derek wasn't a compliance consultant. He was a private investigator hired by Kelthorne Financial's insurance company to investigate irregularities in client accounts. Mr. Williams, Derek said, I understand you've been conducting your own investigation into account discrepancies at Kelthorne Financial. My heart pounded. How did you know about that? Because your father-in-law hired me 3 months ago after receiving complaints from 2 clients about statement inconsistencies. I've been building a case and I believe your wife is at the center of a significant embezzlement scheme. The room seemed to spin. Harold hired you, but when I mentioned your name, he acted like he'd never heard of you. He didn't want to alarm anyone, especially Sandra, until we had conclusive evidence. Unfortunately, your investigation last week spooked her. She's been working overtime to cover her tracks, transferring money between accounts, altering digital records. Then you know about the missing funds. I know about more than missing funds, Derek said grimly. Sandra hasn't just been stealing client money. She's been running a sophisticated Ponzi scheme using new client deposits to cover withdrawals from accounts she's already raided. The total amount missing is approaching $400,000. $400,000. My legs went weak. How many families? 18 client accounts compromised. Most of them retirees who trusted Harold with their life savings. The full scope of Sandra's betrayal hit me like a physical blow. This wasn't just theft. She'd been systematically destroying the financial security of elderly people who'd worked their entire lives to build modest retirement funds. People like Margaret Williams, whose husband had been Harold's first client. People like Thomas and Ruth Bailey, who probably had no idea their money was gone. There's more, Derek continued. We have evidence Sandra's been collaborating with someone at Richmond Trust Bank to facilitate the transfers. This isn't just embezzlement. It's organized financial fraud spanning multiple institutions. What does Harold know? Everything. We briefed him yesterday morning. He's devastated, Joe. He built this business to help families and his own daughter has been using it to destroy them. I sank into a chair. What happens now? We're coordinating with federal investigators. Sandra will be arrested within the next 48 hours. The charges will include wire fraud, money laundering, and elder abuse. She's looking at 15 to 20 years in federal prison. After Derek hung up, I sat in my empty house trying to process everything. The woman I'd married, the woman I'd loved, wasn't just a thief. She was a predator who'd been systematically targeting vulnerable elderly people. While her father celebrated her success, every bonus Harold had given her, every praise he'd heaped on her performance had been based on her ability to steal from the clients they were supposed to protect. I thought about Christmas dinner that evening. Sandra's family would gather around their tree celebrating another successful year for Kelthorne Financial. Harold would probably toast Sandra's performance, talk about how proud he was to have her take over the business. Her mother would gush about Sandra's success, her new car, her designer clothes. They had no idea their golden daughter had spent the last 2 years destroying everything Harold had built. I walked to my desk and pulled out the flash drive I'd prepared. All the evidence I'd compiled was there, but now it seemed insufficient compared to what Derek and the federal investigators had uncovered. Still, it was my evidence, my discovery, my chance to ensure Sandra's victims got justice. I had 6 hours until Christmas Eve dinner. 6 hours to decide what to do with the truth. The decision, as it turned out, was easy. I spent the afternoon making copies of everything. Multiple flash drives, printed documents, detailed summaries of each compromised account. If Derek and the federal investigators already had their case, I wanted to make sure Harold and Sandra's family understood exactly what had been happening under their noses. At 4:00 p.m., Sandra returned from the salon, her hair perfectly styled and her mood cheerful. "You look nice," she said, kissing my cheek as I adjusted my tie. "Ready to go celebrate with my family?" "Ready," I said, slipping the flash drive into my jacket pocket. The drive to Harold's house was surreal. Sandra chatted about her cousin Ashley's new job, her mother's plans for New Year's Eve, her excitement about the bonus Harold was planning to announce at dinner. "He's been hinting about something special," she said, squeezing my hand. "I think he might be ready to make me a full partner." Harold and Patricia's house was decorated for Christmas like something from a magazine. White lights, elegant garland, a 12-wood tree in the living room loaded with ornaments and perfectly wrapped presents. Sandra's extended family was already there. Her Uncle Vincent and Aunt Rebecca, her cousins Ashley and Tyler with their kids, her grandmother Eleanor in her favorite chair by the fireplace. "There's our star," Harold boomed when we walked in, wrapping Sandra in a bear hug. "Come here, sweetheart. I want to tell everyone about your incredible year." I watched Sandra beam under her father's praise. Watched her accept congratulations from relatives who had no idea they were celebrating a criminal. Her cousin Ashley asked about the new BMW. Her Aunt Rebecca complimented Sandra's diamond bracelet. Her grandmother Elena talked about how proud Sandra's grandfather would have been to see her success. Dinner was torture. Harold raised his wine glass and delivered a speech about Sandra's unprecedented performance and her bright future leading Kelthorne Financial. He talked about the trust clients placed in their family, the responsibility they felt to protect people's life savings, the legacy he was proud to pass down to his daughter. Sandra cried happy tears. The family applauded. I wanted to vomit. After dinner, we gathered around the tree for gift exchange. Sandra distributed presents she'd bought with stolen money to people who loved and trusted her. I watched Harold open the expensive watch she'd given him. Watched him tear up as he thanked her for her thoughtfulness. Finally, Patricia suggested we open one present each before waiting until Christmas morning for the rest. The family laughed and picked through the pile, selecting gifts at random. That's when Sandra reached under the tree and pulled out the envelope I'd placed there earlier. "What's this one?" she asked, turning it over in her hands. It was addressed simply to the Peterson family. "I don't recognize the handwriting," Patricia said, examining the envelope. Harold shrugged. "Maybe someone dropped it off and we didn't notice." Sandra tore open the envelope. Inside was a single piece of paper with a message I typed that afternoon. "The truth about how Sandra spent your Christmas money." Below that, taped to the paper, was the flash drive. "What is this?" Sandra asked, but her voice had changed. The color was draining from her face. Harold took the paper and read it aloud. The room fell silent as the meaning sank in. "Joe," Sandra said quietly. "What is this?" I stood up slowly. "It's exactly what it says, Sandra. The truth." Harold was staring at the flash drive like it might explode. "What truth?" "The truth about where Sandra's been getting the money for her new car, her jewelry, her bonuses." I looked directly at Sandra. "The truth about what happened to Thomas and Ruth Bailey's retirement fund." Sandra's face went white. Around the room, family members were looking back and forth between us, confusion turning to alarm. "I think," I said quietly, "it's time everyone knew what kind of success you've really been celebrating." Harold plugged the flash drive into his laptop with trembling hands. The living room fell completely silent except for the Christmas music still playing softly in the background. Sandra sat frozen on the couch, her face pale as paper, while her family gathered behind Harold's chair to see the screen. "Dear God," Harold whispered as the files loaded. The evidence was devastating. Page after page of falsified statements, real account balances showing massive shortfalls. Detailed documentation of every theft Sandra had committed over the past 2 years. Harold's hands shook as he clicked through client accounts, seeing how his daughter had systematically robbed the elderly people who trusted their family with everything they had. "Thomas and Ruth Bailey." Harold read aloud, his voice breaking. "Statement balance $153,000. Actual balance $89,000. He looked up at Sandra, who hadn't moved or spoken. "Sandy, what is this?" Sandra's mother, Patricia, gasped. "Those are the Baileys from church. Ruth has cancer." The room erupted. Cousin Ashley demanded explanations. Uncle Vincent asked if this was some kind of joke. Grandmother Eleanor, reading over Harold's shoulder, made a sound like she'd been punched. "You stole from Margaret Williams," Eleanor said, her voice barely a whisper. "From the Petersons? These people buried their husbands and trusted us with their futures." Harold scrolled through more accounts, each revelation hitting the family like another blow. Sandra finally spoke, her voice small and desperate. "I can explain. I can fix this. The money's not gone. It's just temporarily." "Shut up," Harold said, the words coming out like broken glass. "Just shut up, Sandra." He closed the laptop and stood slowly. When he looked at his daughter, there was something dead in his eyes. 27 years I've built this business. 27 years of helping families, building trust, doing right by people who worked their whole lives for what little they had. His voice was getting louder. And you've been stealing from them, from widows, from retirees, while I bragged about your success to everyone who'd listen. Sandra tried to speak, but Harold held up his hand. Get out of my house, he said quietly. Get out and don't come back. The Christmas music was still playing as Sandra gathered her purse with shaking hands. She looked around the room at her family, her mother crying, her cousin staring at her like she was a stranger, her grandmother's face twisted with disgust. Joe, she said as she reached the door. Please. I shook my head. The federal investigators will be in touch. She left without another word. Through the window, I watched her sit in her BMW for several minutes before driving away. The car she'd bought was stolen money, the last gift she'd ever give herself. Sandra was arrested 2 days after Christmas at her sister's house in Richmond. The federal charges included wire fraud, elder financial abuse, and money laundering. Her accomplice at Richmond Trust Bank was arrested the same day. The investigation revealed the full scope of the scheme. $423,000 stolen from 18 families over 26 months. Harold closed Kelthorne Financial permanently. He couldn't bear the thought of continuing a business his daughter had used to destroy people's lives. He spent his own retirement savings making partial restitution to Sandra's victims, though it couldn't cover everything she'd stolen. The Bailey family got 60% of their money back. Margaret Williams got 73%. It wasn't enough to restore their security, but it was something. Harold visited each family personally to apologize, carrying the weight of his daughter's crimes like stones in his chest. Sandra pleaded guilty to avoid trial and received 18 years in federal prison. At her sentencing, several of her victims spoke about how her theft had forced them to choose between medication and groceries, between heating their homes and paying rent. She sat with her head down, never looking at the people whose lives she'd destroyed. I divorced her while she was in county jail, awaiting sentencing. She signed the papers without contest. Her family never spoke to me again, which I understood. I was a reminder of the worst thing that had ever happened to them. 6 months later, I moved to Charleston and took a job with a small firm that specialized in elder financial protection. It paid less than Keller Financial, but every client I helped protect from fraud felt like penance for not stopping Sandra sooner. Sometimes I wonder if I could have prevented it all by speaking up earlier. But then I remember Thomas and Ruth Bailey getting their money back. Remember Margaret Williams keeping her house. And I know the only thing that mattered was making sure the truth came out. The hardest lesson I learned was that love doesn't protect you from betrayal, but justice delivered at the right moment can protect other people from the ones you loved most.